The national debt has, for so long in Washington, been talked about as an injustice or an unfairness to our children and grandchildren. The reality, and I think what makes what we're doing patently different, is that the children and grandchildren that politicians were talking about in 2005 or 2010 or 2015, they're millennials. They're serving in the U.S. Congress now. They're running some of America's great businesses like all of you are. And I'd pause. I just want to give you this context too, that if this moment feels big and you feel like you've been asked into a conversation and a mission that just seems so enormous that it's overwhelming, I'd remind you that over the 250-year history of our country, every significant movement, in fact, virtually every significant policy change, started with citizens stepping forward and often political leaders following them. It's important that we begin to show leadership on this issue because I'm convinced that our generation is the first that will confront the consequences of what I refer to as an extraordinary and unprecedented experiment in deficit spending that America's entered over the last 20 years. What we know as a fact, though, is that the experiment was set into motion and more or less conducted by a lot of people in Washington who will not be around to see what those consequences are. And we all will be. And that is at the heart of why I think it's important. So grateful that all of you have joined this unique purpose of bringing millennial business leaders together with millennial political leaders to have a conversation about generational stewardship.
What you don't see on the TV is the fact that there is that next generation coming up, people that have served in the military, in the intelligence community, that have had successful private sector careers, but are still young enough where they really feel like they can change the conversation in DC. And I can't think of a more serious problem to tackle than that of our national debt. And in fact, we've gotten to a point where there's now a mainstream economic theory, modern monetary theory, that just says our debt doesn't really matter. It's almost as if when faced with the seemingly insurmountable challenge that is our debt, many of our fellow citizens have chosen to wish the problem away instead of tackling it head on. We had a saying when I was in the military that problems don't age well. And that saying definitely applies to our debt problem today. The longer we wait, the tougher this is going to be to fix. And for some reason, despite the noble efforts of great Americans like the late Senator Tom Coburn and others who've written and spoken and dedicated their lives to fixing parts of this problem, the people in power in both parties have often chosen to ignore the debt, maybe because they never figured it would be a problem in their lifetimes. But as millennials, I just would say we don't have that luxury. And I believe this is really an existential issue for our country. With the coronavirus, we've seen that if we don't act to control the debt in good times, the problem is only going to compound in bad times.
It's a big issue because it requires you to make changes. And it requires you to take steps today to prevent something down the road that no one can see, that you keep hearing about, but it never happens, right? For 20 years, 30 years, people are warned about the debt. So it's a lot like, in some ways, the analogy is the virus, right? Before this virus became a widespread thing that was affecting a lot of people, it would have been very difficult to imagine going back to people in February and saying, we're going to have to start shutting things down. I know we don't have a lot of cases, but this is what we're going to have to do to prevent having cases. And people would have said, what are you talking about? I mean, this is happening halfway around the world. It has nothing to do with us. I mean, that would not have gone over well at the time. I think in hindsight, you look back and say, we wish we would have done some of these things and we could have avoided some of these widespread shutdowns and the economic pain that was created. It's very much the case with the debt. On whether there was a missed opportunity, not really, because this is such a difficult issue that it requires sort of high-level leadership on it, meaning it's hard to do without the White House on board. Clearly, the Obama administration was not very interested in doing it, and the Trump administration hasn't really focused on debt as a main issue that they want to prioritize. But some administration down the road will have to, and my biggest fear is that they'll have to do so not as a forward-thinking policy moves, but as a crisis move. And crisis is always more disruptive than forward thinking. So my hope is that we'll continue to talk about it. At some point, it will become a priority that has a chance of passing. Where I do think you could see a threat is in electronic currencies, in non-national currencies that could eventually emerge with enough participation to be a challenge to our global reserve status. We benefit greatly, directly and indirectly, but in many ways from our global reserve status. And a lot of it is based on the tremendous amount of confidence and goodwill built over 140 years of economic performance. But it's not the kind of thing we can take for granted, especially in a rapidly evolving world. And my sense is that perhaps the biggest threat in the long term is not some national currency, but some non-national currency, Bitcoin type deal that could potentially threaten our reserve stats. So we're a long ways from it, but at the end of the day, we're living in a time of rapid and unexpected change, and I don't think we should be taking any of these things for granted.
I do want to congratulate you for standing up this commission and thank everyone who's on this call. This issue is central to our future. There's no doubt about it, and the previous generations have not done the job, and so it has fallen to you, and I apologize on behalf of those previous generations. And as a result, the Federal Reserve, $3 trillion increase in its balance sheet, and the Congress have responded quickly and on a very large scale to try to support the economy and get the American public through this. I think they should be nothing but congratulated for doing something they do really well, which is spend money. And this is the time to have done that, and they have. So the deficit is going to be very large this year. Over $4 trillion, probably $5 trillion before we're done. That's going to be short term, at least so far. They have been quite disciplined in focusing on 2020 and 2021. And past that, we will go back to the basic problem that the federal government has faced for quite a long time, which is that for as far as the eye can see, the projected spending outstrips projected revenues and the lines diverge. And as a result, the national debt, whether in absolute terms or relative to GDP, continues to rise, and it rises inexorably with no limit. And that is simply unacceptable and quite literally mathematically unsustainable. We are heading mechanically into a debt spiral where we borrow to pay interest on previous borrowing, and it cannot be sustained. The minimum condition that you can ask of a country is that it be capable of stabilizing its debt relative to its GDP, that it has the capacity to raise revenue and control spending to make that hold. The United States has not done that in the 21st century. It has not yet demonstrated the combination of political will and programmatic reforms that will allow it to stabilize debt relative to GDP, much less have it diminish or in other ways target what we would like to do as a nation. That's a tremendous failure.
We do have a moral obligation to get our house in order, folks. I truly believe that. I was on the budget reform, budget and appropriations process reform committee, the Joint Select Committee that was established several years ago. And I really appreciated the opportunity to be on that committee and work in a bipartisan way towards solutions, real meaningful solutions. And at the end of the day, we couldn't come together on legislation. We could not do anything more than just simple window dressing, which didn't take care of our problems at all. There are so many people stuck in the way that we've always done things is the way we're going to continue to do things. And we really do have to move beyond that.
The results it has in terms of fighting crime and cleaning up a city like New York, the same thing's true here. If you just don't sweat the little stuff, you're not going to sweat the big stuff. And so just real quick in terms of what we need to do to do something structural, first and foremost, I think everything should be on budget. I think every dollar of federal spending should be voted on every year. The fact that we have more than 7% of our budget now on a complete automatic pilot is one of the big problems. I'm not saying that's going to be the cure-all, but if members actually had to vote on over $4 trillion of spending every year, it just might make an impact. I'm a big supporter of 2-year budget cycles. You have this massive government. You really do. It'd be nice to have a 2-year budget cycle where you can pass half the appropriation bills in 1 year while you're doing oversight over the other half that you'd passed the previous year. I think that'd be a good structural change.
We can't pinch pennies right now. We've got to get our economy back on track. We got to overcome COVID. But next Congress, we have to have serious conversations about what is an appropriate amount of debt and how we're going to stop the deficit spending, and then how we're going to start chipping away to reduce our debt from really, I think it could be $30 trillion next year. And that's unacceptable.
I think the most telling statistic, right, is your debt to GDP ratio. When you talk to macroeconomists, that is really one of the driving forces underlying a lot of this concern. And so we came into the end of last year, and our debt to GDP ratio was around 79%, call it 80% to keep math simple. This year, we're obviously in a recessionary environment, plus we've dramatically increased traditional spending. And so the projected CBO, Congressional Budget Office, debt to GDP ratio at the end of the year is 101%. That's really the tipping point when you talk to macroeconomists, where you get into a danger zone. There's two things that are going to occur, I think, next year that'll bring some level of stability back to that, which is one, we should see economic growth begin to increase again. And we should, hopefully, we're going to need to pull back the reins on federal government spending. And so what we need to do is kind of have an adult and thoughtful conversation about how we're going to turn the tide and get back to a sustainable path going forward.
The budgetary process is critical to this conversation. And the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress is actually working on that. I'm on that committee, very fortunate to be on there. And we will be promulgating budget reform recommendations here in the next few months. The global economy is not going to allow the United States government to borrow $70 trillion. It's just not. And there will be conversations of our peers and near peers of what can be done, whether it's a basket of currency, whether it is, China actually getting credibility in the global economy somehow and giving an alternative. If we have 50, 60, 70 trillion dollars worth of debt, we will lose our preeminent position, and the dollar will just be in the trash can. And so that is the number one thing that's saving us, because right now there's no alternative. And until there's an alternative, we are going to be able to keep doing this. But the second that there is an alternative, the house of cards will fall.
We could get kind of in the weeds on any one of those points, but I think that's going to be an imperative step of taking the overall driver of the debt, Medicare, Medicaid spending, continue the high quality delivery of the product that overall, big picture, on a global perspective, the U.S. is very satisfied with the quality of their underlying healthcare. They're very unsatisfied with the cost structure. Not only is that true in the private sector side, where people are paying for their insurance out of pocket or often in conjunction with their employer, shows up on the federal debt side in Medicare, in Medicaid. And so I think we're going to have to continue to look for improvements on the delivery structure of healthcare in the United States. I think, Jane, you're spot on that's one of the key components here as we look to bend the curve on our debt to GDP ratio.
Public opinion, because at this point, I think the issue from a debt standpoint is public opinion is going to look at this and they have to look inward. And unfortunately, nobody wants to look at their own credit card debt, student loans, issues in regards to state and municipal debt. This aspect of having to look inward and talk about the issues that we have with debt largely allows people to avoid it, because this is just the issue that we kick the can down the road. Thank you.
I'll jump in first. It's going to take political courage. These are really hard conversations to have. Everyone in the Republican conference that I have spoken this about, they all agree that the number one national security issue facing our country is our debt. And I have fewer friends across the aisle, but I still have many. And they all agree that this is literally the number one national security issue facing our country. So the question becomes, are we going to proactively address this? Are we going to reactively address it? And if we get into a situation where our policies are being dictated to us by our liquidity, by our ability to borrow money, if the world tells us, yeah, we can't do anymore, that's going to be really bad. So how do we get the political courage to start talking about these debt reduction measures that are necessary without the political consequences? When I talk about Social Security, when I talk about healthcare, it's very easy to do a political ad and say, William Timmons wants to take away your Social Security. And I don't want to take away anybody over 40, 50, 60, but my Social Security mathematically cannot be my father's. It's just not possible.
It's so important that we get regular people who have real jobs all over the country engaged on this issue to hold our lawmakers accountable. You'll often hear from lawmakers in Washington that the budget process is broken, and it's become a standard refrain, and I think it's become an excuse not to do the right thing. One of the things I did in the past few years is, because I'm originally from Europe, I looked at different methods by which governments, democratic societies, manage their budget processes to see what works well and what doesn't work. The main problem we have in the United States is that the budget process is it's not transparent and it's not accountable. A lot of people are confused about how it works, and it seems to be set up in a way that is confusing to all but the deepest insiders. And even new members of Congress and their staff often are at a loss for trying to figure out how to leverage this tool, the budget process, in order to improve policy and enact their agenda.
Wesson is going to take some courage, and it's going to take some people who are willing to be uncomfortable and have those fights in Congress, and they've got to know that it matters. And the only reason we could do it is we built support on the outside, and that's what you're doing, is if you don't have support on the outside, Congress will wilt, and you won't find those champions who are going to charge the hill and risk their whole political career if they don't think there's some reward on the outside. And that's where the courage comes from. The courage comes from the Americans all over the country, and that comes back into Congress. Otherwise, they're going to keep spending until they bankrupt the country.
For me to see young people like you and others who are on this call trying to tackle what to me is still ultimately going to be one of the biggest issues our nation has to solve is heartwarming. And so I want to thank you. I want to thank the business leaders, the political leaders have been involved in this issue. I think it's time that the younger generation takes this mantle on. You're creating the leadership for that and creating the fulcrum for that. And I just want to thank you for doing so. It's very difficult when it feels as benign as it does right now to really raise awareness and to make action, to cause action to take place. And that's your challenge. But I applaud you for beginning now. There'll come a time when people will thank you and others on this call for addressing this issue early on and creating the foundation for us to deal with this in a sensible way.
And so I think once we start changing the narrative, it's not just about these abstractions, which are important, right? Empirical analysis is really important, but I think bringing it down into the fact that just spending doesn't just hurt free economies, it actually results in these very specific abuses. When we allow for these unchecked spending, we don't debate these bills, we don't do these things. But, I think from a process, a lot of that comes down to the process points, I think, that have been made. We don't have enough members of Congress right now, I think, that are willing to go to the mat for some of these questions.
And this is obviously a long time coming, and I'm very honored that all of you would commit your time and your intellect to this unique cause and mission that we're all on. It's been about a year since we started the process, and I knew, frankly, at the point at which the late U.S. Senator Dr. Tom Coburn told us that he was on board, that we were on to something that was, at the very least, different than had happened before on this subject. And it was born out of a real desire to see our generation, the millennial generation, step up and lead